a few seconds until every guest can come into the conference and take part in it. Currently, we've got 47 participants, and again, we'll wait a few seconds until we start. Okay, good evening, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jens Bargans. I'm the co-chairman of We Are Europe. We Are Europe is a Düsseldorf-based pro-European organization founded 9 years ago. And I'm one of the hosts of tonight's conference. Very happy to see you and listen to you tonight on this great conference on the question squeezed between two union. We're talking about Scotland and his way to the future. I'm not alone as the host of this conference. We've got two more organizations beside of We're Europe, which will host this conference as well. One of them is the Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung, which is represented tonight by Dr. Thomas Ilka, which I guess you see on the screen. Thomas is the regional director of the European Dialogue in Brussels of the Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung, and he will speak to us in a few minutes as well. The third host is the Europe Direct Information Center of the city of Düsseldorf, represented tonight by Evgenia Strauss, whom you see as well on the screen. Evgenia too will say a few welcome words in a few minutes. But the most important person tonight is Sir Graham Watson, who is the speaker of tonight's conference. Graham, I'm very, very happy to welcome you tonight. It is a huge chance to listen to you tonight, because I think the question of Scotland's future is interesting, is very much interesting for almost every European. I can say a few words about your biography. You are born in Scotland, you're a real Scotsman, and you spent 20 years in the European Parliament, 8 years of which you were the leader of the Liberal Democratic Group. And you have been president of ALDE, the Liberal European Party, for 5 years. So you're one of the really experienced European, one of the most experienced persons we could have tonight as our speaker. Very warm welcome to you, Graham. Very happy to see you here on the screen tonight. So I think we continue with Thomas. Would you please say a few words on behalf of Friedrich-Naumann Foundation?
Yeah, thank you. It's all my pleasure to welcome you as a partner of tonight's show, and Evgenia from Europe Direct Düsseldorf, and of course Graham. We do a lot together, Graham, in Brussels with respect to various issues we will touch upon tonight as well, I guess. My name is Thomas Ilka. I'm the Regional Director of the European Dialogue of the Naumann Foundation. We are present not only in Brussels, but in Prague and Madrid as well. In these three cities, we try to interfere in European politics with regard to foster democracy, open markets, and of course an open society as such all over Europe. But this European Dialogue is only one of 8 regions of the Naumann Foundation worldwide, where we do approximately the same as advocacy for democracy, open markets, and rule of law. So tonight's conference will have the title "Squeezed Between Two Unions." When I give my perspective to the point, I simply want to introduce 3 ideas. Number one is I'm very happy not to be Scottish because so I can refrain from the decision if I would go for independence or not. I think this is a very tough question. We will hear from that on that from Graham. Number second, what I will share with you is the question: will Brussels be happy if Scotland would decide to be independent? What will happen then? How will Brussels see an independent Scotland? How long would an application of an independent Scotland for the European Union will last, and what will that cause in Brussels, but in various capital cities overall Europe as well? And so I come to number three, and this is just something I want to share with you, which comes to my mind when I think about all those questions. When we will have a debate that Scotland might leave the United Kingdom, won't that be just another point of going a downward spiral of another introspective discussion? Don't we need a strong and a united camp of Europeans? And is a Scottish independence really an answer, a good answer to that? Those are questions crossing my mind, although, of course, you can make a possible case for Scottish independence, but I'm sure Graham will enlighten us on those questions and we will have a good discussion. Let me finish with that one. And may I give the word directly to Evgenia, Jens, if you are fine with that.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear Graham, dear Jens. My name is Evgenia Strauss. I'm in charge of the Düsseldorf's Europe Direct Information Center. We are part of the European Commission's network, and we're also part of the Mayor's office in Düsseldorf. And therefore, we combine the European and the municipal perspectives. Our job is to organize and promote events like today's, and to offer information for citizens on EU-related topics. And we also organize, for instance, educational field trips to EU institutions, workshops for students, and we support local organizations by funding projects with European perspectives in Düsseldorf. Today we will speak about Scotland and the implications that Brexit will have for the Scottish people and for Europe. And before we come to that, I would like to briefly draw your attention to the question why Brexit is a big deal for Düsseldorf and North Rhine-Westphalia. Because North Rhine-Westphalia is Britain's closest German economic partner, with actually more British exports, more investments, more businesses as any other federal state. And there are almost 150 town twinnings, also more than with any other German region. There are ties between universities and between schools, and a close exchange of culture, science, and sport. That's why it's a very emotional issue for us. And also this year, North Rhine-Westphalia and the United Kingdom celebrate their 75-year partnership. Because it was 1946 that the British military administration created the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia and made Düsseldorf its capital, was called Operation Marriage. And today, North Rhine-Westphalia is the economic powerhouse of Germany and also one of the prosperous economic regions, one can say. So therefore, we are deeply grateful to the United Kingdom for their partnership and for their friendship in the last 75 years. And we hope that this partnership will continue despite Brexit. When speaking of partnership, this brings us back to the initial question. And we are very excited to hear about, which path Scotland is going to take in the future towards the UK or towards the EU.
Thank you very much, Evgenia, and thank you to Thomas as well. Graham, just a few words before you start. If we look back into the British history, I think we have one major milestone every 100 years. If we look back to 1603, the Scottish kings became the kings of England. If we go further to 1707, we see the union between England and Scotland. If we go to 1801, we see the union of both with the Kingdom of Ireland. And if we go back to 1922, we see the secession of Ireland, which reduced the United Kingdom to Northern Ireland on the Irish island. So the question is, now 100 years gone since the secession of Ireland, is there something which we must face in the next years? Do we see an exit of Scotland? Is that likely to happen? And I'm sure you will give us some very interesting answers. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jens, and good evening, everybody. Let me start by thanking you for your very kind invitation, thanking Marie-Christine and Michael Meyer on behalf of the ALDE Party individual members in Germany who first approached me, by thanking Evgenia Strauss and Europe Direct, by thanking the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for putting this together, and particularly by thanking you for the honor of having a meeting chaired by Secretary of State Jens Bagans, former mayor of Mulham, on behalf of We Are Europe. It's a great pleasure to be with you tonight, and I look forward very much to our discussion. What can I say about my qualifications for talking on this subject? I'm afraid they're not good. I'm not an historian, although I enjoy and have read quite a lot of history. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, or indeed a lawyer of any kind. I'm not even a political scientist, although since data is only ever really the plural of anecdote, I suppose I might have something to contribute in that field. Indeed, when I was approached and asked to speak on this subject, I was reminded of the speaker who said to the people inviting him, "Look, it's very kind of you to invite me, but I can think easily of 10 people who are far better qualified than I am." To which they replied, "Well, so can we, but none of them is available." You have me tonight. I am a Scot, a Brit, a European. I'm somebody who's had the honor of serving for 20 years in the European Parliament, including 7.5 years as leader of its Liberal group, and then for 5 years as president of the Liberal Party at European level. I am somebody who, like the majority of Scots, has never favored independence. I believe that Scotland benefits hugely from being a part of the United Kingdom and has benefited from the international alliances in which the United Kingdom has been active. But also, and probably along with a majority of my fellow countrymen, I have never feared independence for Scotland. Scotland is a country of 5.5 million people, and there is no reason why it could not survive perfectly adequately as an independent state, as it did for many hundreds of years. I identify as a Scot, as a Brit, as a European, and as a global citizen. In a fairly recent general election campaign in the United Kingdom, Theresa May, who was the Conservative Prime Minister at the time, said, well, people who claim they are global citizens are actually citizens of nowhere. I reject that. I am a citizen of anywhere. I am part of a long Scots tradition of people who have emigrated and done things elsewhere, but who retain strong links to Scotland. Indeed, I have a home in Edinburgh. Up until about 1750, so for a long, long period, the Scots were very, very active across the continent of Europe as merchants, as explorers, traders, as mercenaries in armies from Lithuania over to Sweden. From 1750 onwards, I think it's fair to say that Scotland's approach looked west rather than east, and people looked to the New World for places to make their fortune, and to Asia, and later to Africa. Today, you will find Scots right across the world. We are a people who built the city of Tampere together with the Swedes, who built the city of Buenos Aires together with the Italians, who built the city of Hong Kong together with the Chinese, who built the city of Montreal together with the French, and so on and so on. We provided the engineers and the architects and much of the finance for these great projects. Of course, if you want to discuss Scotland's constitution, Scotland possibly squeezed between two unions, you need to recognize that until fairly recently in history, Scotland was an independent nation. When we teach history in British schools, we tend to start with the Roman conquest. Well, 2,000 years ago, when the Romans tried to invade the United Kingdom, they didn't really get into Scotland. They got a little way, but they soon had to build a wall. The Emperor Hadrian built what is called Hadrian's Wall, and it is effectively the boundary between Scotland and England these days. We survived attacks from the Norse and the Danes in the first millennium after Christ. In 1320, the famous Declaration of Arbroath, 700 years ago, the barons and the community of Scotland wrote to Pope John the 22nd, asking him to recognize Scotland's independence and acknowledge Robert the Bruce as the country's lawful king. It has some wonderful, wonderful literature in it. I quote from it. "It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself." We are a people who have recognized themselves as such and fought to defend their territory as such. And I would urge anyone looking at Scotland not to underestimate the role that Scotland played in medieval Europe, in its universities, in its medicine, in various branches of scientific development. You talked, Jens, about 1603, the Union of the Crowns, when under the Stuart monarchy in Scotland, there was no heir to the throne of England. And the King of Scotland, King James VI, was invited to become King James I of England. Well, that was okay for a few years, but in 1650, with the beheading of King Charles I, Oliver Cromwell then led an army which invaded southern Scotland, and it was only the return of the monarchy under Charles II which started the cooperation between Scotland and England once again. But cooperation there was, and in 1707, as you rightly pointed out, we had the union of the parliaments. The Scottish Parliament was dissolved, the English Parliament was dissolved, and the Parliament of Great Britain was established. Now, I think it's important to remember that in those days, the Parliament was rather less important than either the church or the judiciary. Scotland retained its own judiciary, its own system of law, and its own kirk, the Church of Scotland. The reason for the union and there may have been many, but the primary reason was economic self-interest. It is true that Scotland was impoverished after a risky and ultimately unsuccessful venture in Central America. But still, there were reasons for Scotland and England to come together. And you need look no further than the rapid economic development after 1707 to see how it benefited both countries. That economic development was not due primarily to the union with England, but access to English and Commonwealth markets was important because the Spanish Wars of Succession had closed off Scotland's access to continental markets. And the subsequent development of the British Empire depended to a fairly large extent on Scotland's contribution, soldiers, as traders, as financiers. So please, when you think of Scotland, and I say this particularly to a German audience, think not of the film Highlander and Sean Connery. Think not of the Netflix series Outlander. Think of the social and educational progress under an enlightened and cosmopolitan leadership, which gave Scotland an educated and enterprising people. Think also of limits to opportunity at home. You know, Scotland is a country the size of the state of Hesse. Scotland represents, in terms of Britain's population, what Lower Saxony represents in terms of Germany's population. Think of the limits to opportunity at home for the people of Scotland. Remember that in the 1690s, not long before the union of the parliaments, there were 3 years of famine in which many died. Remember that in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was ethnic cleansing of the Gaelic people of northwestern Scotland. Think that if you visit Scotland today, you can still see 19th century tenement blocks, 20th century high-rise blocks, which are not really fit for human habitation. If you look at the statistics on drug and substance abuse, alcohol abuse, if you look at the statistics for domestic violence, if you look at mental health. In fact, I would recommend to anybody the book which won the Booker Prize last year, a book by Doug Stewart called Shuddy Bain, which talks about what life is like in some of the inner cities and some of the ghastly out-of-city housing estates in Scotland today. This is the dilemma for the educated Scot. Scotland has a beautiful, rugged scenery. Scotland has a people who will withstand hardship. But Scotland is not the glamorous, romantic place that some would like to make it out to be. You know, the Victorians, there's a whole array, a whole library of Victorian literature glamorizing Scotland. Take the poem Scotland by Sir Alexander Gray, where he says, "This is my country, the land that begat me. These windy spaces are surely my own, and those who here toil in the sweat of their faces are flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone." It's wonderful Victorian rubbish, but it's not really Scotland. You have to turn to a poem written in 1941 by Edwin Muir to read of some of the difficulties when he writes, "Courage beyond the point and obdurate pride made us a nation and robbed us of a nation. defiance absolute and myriad-eyed that could not pluck the palm, plucked our damnation. There's a lot of difficulty in Scotland, as well as a lot of opportunity. And when there was the union with England, there was opposition to the union of the parliaments, mainly Catholics and Episcopalians, but not only. There were concerns about bribery of the Scottish MPs who voted in favour of the deal, who might not otherwise have done. Indeed, Robert Burns wrote a famous song in which he writes, "We are bought and sold for English gold, such a parcel of rogues in a nation." There was an attempt to re-establish independence in 1715. It very nearly succeeded. There was a rather more famous and more glamorized rebellion in 1745, which frankly never stood a chance. But in the end, it suited Scotland to have the military protection and the economic opportunity offered by the union with England. And I think it's important to understand that Britain was a union. It was not an English takeover. We established a Parliament of Great Britain. We established the Acts of Union in 1800 and 1801. And Scotland went on to play a very important role in the British Empire, in North America, in Asia, and elsewhere. Do you know that in 1843, 60% of all the tobacco imports into the United Kingdom came into the port of Glasgow. And 40% of what was brought in was then traded on to the continent of Europe, to markets in the Low Countries and in Germany. Glasgow was better placed because of its geographical location as an opening for North American trade than were the major ports of England. I want to bring you, let me just mention something else about that period, which I think is relevant. Look at the major companies that were formed under the British Empire. Look at the East India Company. It was staffed largely by expatriate Scots. Look at the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, now HSBC Group and one of the 4 or 5 biggest banks in the world. That was an expatriate Scottish bank established in Hong Kong in 1862. Look right across the empire, from India across to China, and right down through Africa, Kenya, and particularly Malawi, which was effectively a Scottish colony. And you will see how Scots numerically benefited more from empire than their English neighbors. And of course, the empire existed for a long, long time, right up until beyond the Second World War. When I grew up in the 1950s and the 1960s, few people really talked about being Scottish or English. We were all British together. Of course, we had different countries, but essentially we were Brits. And I believe that if the United Kingdom had joined the European Economic Community at the start, or even in the 1960s, we might have avoided some of the difficulties which the development of nationalism has created. But we joined in 1973 under a Conservative government led by Edward Heath. And nationalism in Wales and in Scotland, and of course, tragically, in Northern Ireland, was already becoming a problem again. In 1975, under the Labour government of Harold Wilson, a referendum was held as to whether we should remain within the European Union. 67% voted in favour of staying, and only 33% against. But in Scotland, the enthusiasm in that referendum was much, much lower. There were some parts of Scotland which voted against staying in the European Union, I think particularly of the Western Isles, and a large part of northern Scotland where a majority voted against remaining. If you move forward to the referendum of 2016, you find in Scotland 62% of the people voting to stay, where in England the majority were against. And that may be because in the intervening years of the 1980s and the 1990s, we saw the rise of English nationalism. I saw this very pointedly in my own constituency, because although I hail from Scotland, my wife is Italian. She did not want to live too far from her parents, and so I was elected to the European Parliament for an English constituency. And I noticed fairly soon that the flag of St. George, the red cross on the white background, which previously one never saw, started appearing in people's houses and elsewhere. We saw a rise of English nationalism, which led to a referendum where, by a margin of 52% to 48% in 2016, the United Kingdom voted to withdraw from the European Union, although Scotland and Northern Ireland voted in favour of staying. Why the change? Well, if you look at it from Scotland's perspective, or indeed from Northern Ireland's, we developed a Europe of the regions. Indeed, it was one of the British European Commissioners, Bruce Millan, who started a lot of the debate leading towards that. We saw within the United Kingdom a devolution of power. The Scottish Parliament was established in May 1999, after a long period of dialogue between Scotland and England about what needed to be done. Greater power was given too to the Northern Ireland Assembly. Within the context of the European Union, administrative devolution became easier. But with the rise of national identity, the Scottish National Party won a majority in the Scottish Parliament in 2011 and has held that majority in the 10 years since. We saw Scotland Acts of Parliament in 2012 and 2016, which gave more power to the Scottish Parliament. The SNP, which had been against European Union membership until 2008, suddenly decided to favour it, because they recognized that autonomy was possible within the context of the European Union. And in the independence referendum, which the SNP held in 2014, they argued for independence for Scotland within the European Union. It was only an appearance by Mr. Barroso, the President of the European Commission, telling Scotland that if it voted for independence, there was no guarantee it would be accepted into the European Union, I believe, which swung that vote. Liberal Democrats campaigned in that referendum against independence. We campaigned to stay in the United Kingdom in order to stay in the European Union, because we know the value of alliances. And we won. 53% of the people of Scotland voted to remain within the United Kingdom, and only 47% against. And we went on 2 years later in the European Union referendum in 2016 to persuade people in every single electoral district of Scotland to vote to stay in the European Union. So why are we in the situation in which we find ourselves? Well, the Brexit referendum result has placed a big question mark over the future of the United Kingdom. Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain in the European Union, England and effectively Wales to leave. If you try to force the people of Scotland to leave one union in order to remain in another, then of course there will be a debate. The same is true in Northern Ireland, and for what it is worth, I believe that Northern Ireland is more likely to leave the United Kingdom than is Scotland, and that were both to leave, it would happen in Northern Ireland first, because the relative ease of a border poll, which would see the reunification of the island of Ireland, is much less of a hurdle than the difficulty of putting up a border between Scotland and England for economic or other purposes. Try to imagine Scotland as a member of the European Union. It is a country about the same size in population terms as Denmark or Finland or Slovakia, each of which does more than adequately as a European Union member. But I have to say, we resemble Slovakia rather more than Denmark. Our productivity is low, our economic growth rates are weak, the ratio of our exports to gross domestic product is about half the European Union average. We fail to manage well the policies devolved to the Scottish Parliament in health or education or social welfare, and our public finances are a mess. Scotland would not even meet the convergence criteria required of any country wishing to join the European Union. Our debt and our annual deficit are too high. In addition to which, we have now a new problem. Any of you who followed the politics of Scotland in recent weeks will have seen the argument between the current First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, and her predecessor, Alex Salmond. What is significant about this is not that one politician should try to do down another. It is that the separation of powers within Scotland has been called into question. We have seen that there is no effective separation between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. And we've had difficulty getting the government to publish the legal advice they were given in a case which cost the taxpayer over £500,000. We have an election coming up in Scotland on the 6th of May this year, 8 weeks' time. I think it's likely that the Scottish National Party will be returned with a majority, although there's no doubt that the current difficulties will have hit their vote. I think it is clear that the opinion polls show a consistent majority in favour of independence for Scotland, and even a majority of Conservatives in England who would have no objection to Scotland leaving the Union. Boris Johnson will almost certainly refuse any demand from the next Scottish government for another independence referendum. And we may end up in the situation that Catalonia has been in now for some years. And I have to add, by way of personal opinion, that the leadership of the Scottish National Party looks little better than the leadership of the Catalan independentists at the moment. If we have an independence referendum, I guess that we will see a majority of voters supporting it. In the last one, 43% of people who vote Liberal Democrat voted in favour of an independent Scotland. The numbers among Labour voters and Conservative voters were smaller, but nonetheless, there is quite a strong popular demand. And yet the case against independence is also very strong. The economic disruption that it would cause, which has been drawn attention to by reports from the Fraser of Allender Institute in Stirling, the extra cost that a Scottish government would have to bear in a country where income tax is already higher than in England, the lack of influence or the loss of influence that Scotland would incur as an independent country, and the fact that we'd have to deal with the currency issue. The Scottish National Party very studiously avoids talking about whether Scotland would join the euro, because at least 1/3 of their own supporters are reckoned to disagree with it. Could Scotland have a velvet divorce in the way that Slovakia did from the Czech Republic? Perhaps. Perhaps it could persuade people to take it seriously and to respect its achievements. But it would need to start with a lot of work at home. And I think the challenge for those in Scotland who argue for independence is that they need a clear, comprehensive strategy, understood and backed by a majority of the people, in a country which is not a state, but which is not powerless either, and would need to find the resources to put the policies in place and to deliver the strategy consistently over the next decade to sort out Scotland's public finances. It has to start with strengthening the economy. If the country of James Watt and Adam Smith wishes to contribute to renewed European debate on industry and trade, Scotland needs to recover from its underperformance in productivity and innovation. And it needs to lift its horizons. Its exports are worth a paltry £80 billion, of which 50 billion goes, at least initially, to the rest of the United Kingdom. Scotland is doing well in renewable energy, but if it's serious about a 90% cut in greenhouse gas emissions in 30 years from now, it needs a huge investment in insulation of its housing stock, for example. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP26, will be held this year in Glasgow. Scotland does not have a great story to tell. I think a question for liberals is the role of identity. And if the mastermind of the 19th century was the German socialist Karl Marx, who defined identity on grounds of class, and if the mastermind of the 20th century was a Scottish liberal, expatriate Scottish liberal Woodrow Wilson, who defined identity in terms of the self-determination of nations, the question I would ask is whether the mastermind of the 21st century is not another expat Scot, and a very right-wing one, probably the most influential Scot of our time, Rupert Murdoch, who defines identity in terms of a witch hunt against people who are different. The French novelist Albert Camus wrote in a letter to a friend, "J'aime trop mon pays pour être nationaliste." I love my country too much to be a nationalist. That is how I feel about Scotland. I believe that on balance, we gain through a united effort for the attainment of common goals. Essentially, I'm a federalist in the sense of Robert Burns' famous poem, that man to man the world o'er shall brothers be, and all that. That is why I will work hard to get the United Kingdom back into the European Union. But the United Kingdom is governed by conservative nationalists. And as Konrad Adenauer observed after years of experience with German conservatives, God placed limits on man's reason, but alas, not on his stupidity. And I cannot speak for what the English Conservatives will do. What I can say is that Scotland's patience is not infinite. You're on mute, Jens.
Graham, thank you very much for, as I think, a very impressive speech, which gave us the whole picture on the Scottish issue, from historical backgrounds to the present and the future. I think we all got the very message of your speech. You love your country, you love Scotland. However, you are in doubt whether a way of independence would lead into a good future for Scotland. I think that's the message that you sent us. And we have already a number of questions that were sent to us, and which would I like to read. There's one sent to us by, let me see. Please, our guests, would you please use the F&A button to ask your questions, and not the chat button that makes things a lot easier. Someone is asking the question, what is Labour's strategy in Scotland? That's a good question. I mean, you're a Liberal, but anyway, could you say something about Labour's strategy for Scotland?
Well, Labour has just, as in last Saturday, just elected a new leader in Scotland. He is a very intelligent, very committed member of the Scottish Parliament from Glasgow, of Asian extraction, a man by the name of Anas Sarwar. And I think he will probably be a better leader for the Labour Party in Scotland than their recent leadership. But they need it. The Labour Party now has only one Westminster MP in the whole of Scotland. The Labour Party has lost the vast majority of its support to the Scottish National Party. And the only significant figure in Labour politics in Scotland at the moment is Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, before that Chancellor of the Exchequer for 10 years under Tony Blair, who is a little past his sell-by date in some respects. So I hope that the Labour strategy will be to work with the Liberal Democrats, as Labour and Liberal Democrats did for many years from 1999 to 2011, in coalition in the Scottish Parliament, for a country which offers its people maximum of opportunity and freedom possible, consistent with responsible government. But I think Labour has a long, long way to climb back in Scottish politics. And I'm not sure how they do that under the leadership of Keir Starmer in London, a man who refuses to talk about Brexit because he doesn't wish to offend some anti-European traditional Labour voters.
Another question by one of our guests. He is asking, how likely do you think there will be a future minority government in Scotland? Because you talked about the next elections in May. Is there a minority government likely to be elected?
Well, that's a very difficult question. But would you allow me to break all of the rules of politics and give you a completely honest answer? Mm-hmm. I think the SNP may try to form a minority administration. I imagine they will still be the largest party. after the elections on the 6th of May. They are currently in office with the support of the Greens. They may or may not need the Greens after this election, but I suspect they will. What I'm afraid does not look likely is that, let us say, a rainbow coalition of Conservative, Labour, and Liberal Democrat would have enough support in Parliament to form an administration. I think we're in for another parliamentary term dominated by the SNP, but I think it will be their last for a very long time because their weaknesses are becoming more evident by the day.
Mhm. Why does the SNP repeatedly win elections if they can't win the independence referendum? That's a good one.
Well, as they say, the devil has all the best tunes. You know, the nationalist message is a very simple one. It is, whatever is wrong in your life, it is because of the union with England. If you want to improve it, vote for independence. Things will be different. What they fail to deal with is how that will be the case. Because the reality is that Scotland receives, through the distribution of funding within the UK, Scotland receives a subsidy from England. And although the SNP would like to argue that all of the debt that the United Kingdom has must be English debt because it's issued by the Bank of England, the reality is it's shared across the population of the United Kingdom.
Graham, great to hear you speaking again after many years. We have already started to see how economically painful the Brexit separation is turning out for many economic sectors after less than 50 years of cooperation. Scotland's close economic links to England long predate the Act of Union. Surely economically, Scottish independence would be close to suicidal. That's the question.
I'm not an economist, but I follow with great interest the debate in Scotland on the economy. I worked for a number of years in banking, and I think I have a reasonably good grasp of how economies work. I don't think that independence for Scotland would be any more suicidal in economic terms than the United Kingdom withdrawing from the single market and the customs union.
Mm-hmm.
In time, the United Kingdom will overcome the disruption to its economy that leaving the European Union has caused. But it will be a poorer, weaker country, probably seeing a loss of about 6% of its gross domestic product. I think the same would apply to Scotland under independence. Scotland is particularly vulnerable, rather like Finland, which has in some ways a similar history in its relations with Sweden, particularly vulnerable to being dependent on very few important industries: the whiskey industry, the fishing industry, agriculture and food production in general. And those industries need time to adapt to a change in markets. Scotland is also vulnerable to the movement of people. The Scottish government has used the powers it has to increase the rate of income tax in Scotland above that in England. Personally, I welcome this because it's instituting a far fairer income tax system, a more progressive system. But there's a limit to which you can do that without some people deciding that they'll move south of the border. So I think, there are big economic questions to be answered. And unless the economy is very healthy and the government policy very clear, then I think it's difficult to see how we could overcome economic disruption.
There's one question regarding the Erasmus program of the European Union, and our guest is asking, do you think there could be a separate agreement on a replacement of Erasmus with Scotland alone?
The Scottish government would love it. The Welsh government has asked formally for it, and the government in London has said very clearly no. It was an issue apparently that was, I don't say discussed, but at least brought up in the talks between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and the United Kingdom government decided that they did not wish that to be a possibility. If you look at what's happened in Northern Ireland, you have a very interesting situation, because the Republic of Ireland has offered to the citizens of Northern Ireland, who have the right to hold Irish passports as well as United Kingdom passports, the right to participate in the Erasmus program. There is no similar right for students in Scotland or in Wales, and it is a point of contention. Education is hugely important. The writer George Orwell once said that the whole of human history becomes increasingly a race between education and catastrophe. And the lack of access to education in other countries, essential for a cosmopolitan outlook, will cost us dear. But I'm afraid it's off the agenda for the moment.
Mm-hmm. Graham, apparently you have a very good insight into different European countries, particularly Germany. That's why one of our guests would like to know, how would you describe the view on Scotland from continental Europe, maybe from Germany in special? Is it too romantic and much orientated on unrealistic wishes to regain British friends after a frustrating Brexit negotiation procedure? Are Germans too romantic on the Scottish issue, about the Scottish issue?
I think one of the difficulty for liberals the world over is we tend to be perhaps romantic about other countries and particularly critical of our own. Mm-hmm. Scotland has welcomed many, many German students into its universities. It welcomes many thousands of German visitors every year. Germany has done the same for Scotland. I had the great opportunity of studying in a German university, although I have to tell you that it was in the German Democratic Republic. It was the Karl Marx University in Leipzig, but I could have chosen Germersheim or Tübingen or one of the others. You know, the opportunities there are great, but yes, I think sometimes Germany has a rather romantic view of Scotland, based perhaps more on Hollywood than on Holyrood.
Yeah, that's why you mentioned the Outlander in your speech. Was the Blair government led by example or by political science concerning the idea of devolution? Is there a theory or a book, a greater framework that you could mention? That's the question.
I'm not sure of a book, although there must be. And if whoever asked the question would like to contact me by email or otherwise, I will certainly look for one. But what I think is important to appreciate is that the Blair government elected in 1997 did not suddenly decide to legislate for devolution. What had happened throughout the 1980s and the 1990s was a process of discussion about how Scotland could gain a greater say in its own affairs. You have to remember that in 1979, there was a referendum on independence for Scotland. A majority of those who voted in favor of independence. But the law which created the referendum required an absolute majority of voters not just of the ones who went to vote, to be in favor. And so the referendum failed. And what happened after 1979 was a 20-year process in which those who favoured devolution for Scotland, mainly from the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats, but including some Conservatives, came together in a thing called the Scottish Constitutional Convention and worked out a plan for how it would be achieved. And that plan became part of the planning done by Tony Blair before he came into government, when he believed that he might need the support of the Liberal Democrats in order to run the country. And the plan was taken forward and Scotland's Parliament achieved. So Blair did not act in isolation. The fact that he had been educated in a Scottish school, albeit a rather expensive fee-paying Scottish school, may have helped.
That's interesting. Another question concerning the whole of the United Kingdom. It just went away. Do you see any move of young, idealistic people to lead the whole United Kingdom back into the European Union? Because I think the question behind is that people believe that the younger generation is very much in favor of the membership in the European Union more than the elder generation. So I think that's the background of the question.
I think it's undoubtedly true, and the questioner is right. If you look at what we know of the votes in the referendum, the Brexit referendum, broken down by age group, the over 65s were overwhelmingly in favor of leaving the European Union, and the under 25s were overwhelmingly in favor of remaining. And it is true that a lot of young people now feel they have nowhere to go. Some of them may well leave the country. The number of people leaving the United Kingdom has increased. And this is not just the continentals who were previously working here. This is many British people who have decided that they would rather live on the continent in the situation where the United Kingdom is out of the European Union. The problem that a lot of young people have is they don't see how to organize to win in a country in which the voting system ensures that even with a minority of the vote, you can have a majority of seats in Parliament.
Yeah. That's a good bridge to the next question. Someone saying there might be a lack of democratic essence within the European Union. Why is there any? So, is there any reason for the Scottish to leave UK to join the EU? The less democratic union. I think that's what he means.
A very pertinent question.
Yeah.
I mean, look at what's happening across the world today. You know, we live in a global village. We have a global community. We are working together to tackle many common global problems. But we have no real global democracy. In the European Union, we have established democratic structures, but I'm not sure that we really have a European demos. And this is one of the difficulties in debates about the European Union. But my feeling is that in Scotland, there is not a great confidence in the level of democracy in the United Kingdom. And many people feel that they might even have a greater say in the management of their own affairs within the European Union framework than they do within the framework of the United Kingdom.
May I just interrupt the question and answers to welcome two persons which I was asked to welcome in the beginning of the conference. I'm sorry I forgot that. I'd like to welcome Rob Harrison. Rob Harrison is the executive member of the Liberal Democrats in Europe, and he's a member of the Association British in Germany. Rob, sorry, I forgot you to mention at the beginning of the conference. And the second one I'd like to welcome is Rainer Mathiesen. Rainer Mathiesen is a member of the Liberal group in the NRW Landtag, and he's the speaker of the committee, the impacts of Brexit on NRW. I think there are quite a lot of them. Sorry to have forgotten to mention you in the beginning. There are more questions. There's one which I would like to read, asked by my friend David Scrimger. The impact of Brexit on Scottish exports to the EU is already having a negative effect, particularly on the food and drink industry. Scotland is also a major recipient of Erasmus funds, which has now been closed down. And the Scottish population is declining, and there is a need for immigration, which will become increasingly difficult. Does Sir Graham accept that there may be a point at which the Scots feel that there is nothing to lose by voting for independence?
Well, I could say, David, that importantly, to my mind, Scotland has taken a very different attitude, the government of Scotland, towards immigration than has the government of the United Kingdom at Westminster. I am immensely proud of one thing. I was born in the 1950s on a small island off the west coast of Scotland. It's the island of Bute. The island at that time had a population of nearly 25,000 people. The island now has a population of just over 17,000, and the depopulation has become so serious that about 6 or 7 years ago, people sat down and talked about what they could do to remedy the situation. And they petitioned the Scottish government to be allowed to take 100 immigrants from Syria, refugees from the war in Syria. Those immigrants came. They are about 23 families in total. The women found work very quickly. The children were all enrolled in the local schools and in the local health service. It took a bit longer to find work for all of the men, but the integration of 100 Syrian refugees into the community of the island Bute has been absolutely stunningly successful. And the Scottish government has now asked the British government for permission to run a special visa scheme for people to come and live in Scotland. The British government is reluctant to agree to this, but who knows, in the end, it might get there. But I'm sure of one thing, that the current British opposition, I would even say hostility to foreigners, is yet another arrow in the bow of those who seek independence.
I just try to understand the next question. Someone is asking if people are looking for freedom, and you mentioned that Scots are usually searching for a maximum of freedom. Would that mean, would that be the reason why Scottish would vote for independence, because they could live freer in the European Union than in the United Kingdom? Would that be a major argument for independence?
I think people the world over strive for freedom, and I'm not sure we can claim any particular Scots exceptionalism in this regard. But it is certainly true that the Scottish National Party has managed to persuade people that they would have greater freedom if they were independent. And the best way to deal with this, they would argue, is to try it. Is it true? Freedom is a very difficult thing to define. freedom, if you grow up in some of the council estates in the major cities, is not very great. Freedom, if you are educated at some of Scotland's better schools from a middle-class background, can be tremendous. You know, yes, it's an argument, but it's only one.
Mm-hmm.
And what I worry about with this argument is that too often it is opposition to or hostility to the English rather than favor of Scotland. You know, to me, there is a difference between a patriot and a nationalist. A patriot loves their country. A nationalist hates their neighbors.
Yeah.
And the SNP are nationalists, not patriots.
You chose to speak a lot about the question of independence. Well, that was the subject of the conference. It dominates, indeed, the political discussion in Scotland. Isn't there a very detrimental, divisive effect on politics of this focus? This is Boris Johnson's argument against a repeat of the referendum. And the current fish fight within the SNP, aren't we seeing the depth of deprivation which comes with independence movements? Wouldn't it be better to talk about other questions which are more constructive and relevant to the lives of both Scots and Germans?
Well, it's a good question, and I think that it's absolutely true, the assumption behind it. You have to realize that Scotland is still today, and we are now 7 years since the independence referendum in 2014, Scotland is still a society riven by that debate.
Mm.
We've not really managed to move forward in our politics. There are many things that we should be arguing for. Some of the powers which were exercised at European Union level, which have been returned to the United Kingdom, should perhaps be in the purview of the Scottish Parliament rather than the Westminster Parliament. But it's very hard to argue for that if you are so driven by the idea of independence that you are neglecting other areas of policy where progress desperately needs to be made.
Could I ask a personal question? We didn't talk about COVID-19 in this conference. I'm one of the followers of Nicola Sturgeon on her Facebook's website, and there's a lot of messages about COVID-19, the fight of the Scottish government against COVID-19. What impact has this pandemic on Scotland and the question we are talking about tonight?
Well, it's very interesting. Generally, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, is regarded to have done a rather good job on COVID-19, while Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, was, at least until recently, not seen as doing a good job. When you look at the policies, all that happened was Scotland would introduce a restriction 24 hours before it would be introduced at Westminster. The policies were essentially the same. Nicola Sturgeon is a far better public performer in terms of credibility and trust than is Boris Johnson. And I think that has become very evident. Might I say, Jens, in following this, that you have a wonderful German, well, I'm not sure if it's a German word, but it's a word in my German. It's the word Zweisamkeit. Scotland and England are tied together by being on the same island. It's a very difficult relationship. It's rather like two characters in the costume of a pantomime horse, each pulling in different directions. I think you would say in German, das ist keine echte Zweisamkeit, das ist bloß Einsamkeit zu zweit. And I apologize to the non-German speakers for not being able to translate that. but it is an issue in relations between Scotland and England.
Yes. Someone is comparing Scotland, or would like you to compare Scotland to other autonomous regions in Europe, for example, Southern Tyrol in Italy. How many liberties does Scotland have in comparison to these? Which fields of politics are decided in London, and how's that? Is there any comparison possible between Scotland and other more or less independent regions in Europe?
Scotland has a fairly considerable degree of self-government. What is provided by the government at Westminster is defence, foreign affairs, large parts of policy on taxation and economic development. But more or less everything else is run by the Scottish government at Holyrood. The big areas of spending, whether it's health, education, policing, policy, or most policy on the environment and so on, that is set by the Scottish government. I think many Scots are satisfied with the level of self-determination that Scotland has achieved. But it will never be enough for the absolutists. And, you know, well, I think there's a belief in Scotland that, you know, if the sun never set on the British Empire, it was because God would never trust the English in the dark. It's not something from which I suffer. I have no problem trusting and working together with my British compatriots from south of the border. But I believe we can solve our differences peacefully, whether we end up in one union or whether we end up as separate countries.
Graham, could you elaborate more on how you will campaign for the United Kingdom to rejoin the EU? How much will that be your personal case?
I'm somebody who has devoted his whole political career first to getting the United Kingdom into the European Union, and secondly to building a strong United Kingdom within a strong European Union. It is a matter to me of the deepest regret and dismay that the United Kingdom has decided to leave. I put so much personal energy into stopping it happening that I ended up in hospital for 4.5 months back in 2017. I will continue to fight to get the United Kingdom back into the European Union. But equally, if it's going to prove impossible, I think I am one of a number of people who will not continue to bash their heads against a brick wall for more than a decade or so.
Some questions are referring to the currency issue. Thank you very much for this interesting speech. You mentioned the problems regarding currency arrangements should Scotland become independent. Could you elaborate on why many Scottish citizens do not wish to join the euro? What arrangements would you expect to be put in place in case of independence?
As the questioner probably knows, any country wishing to join the European Union these days needs to sign up to becoming part of the euro. And Scotland would be expected to do the same. I don't exclude the possibility that Scotland might reach an agreement to remain outside the euro for a number of years until its economy reached a stage where it could easily join. But many of the supporters, well, let me put it this way, about 1/3 of the supporters of the SNP, it is believed, are not only anti-English, but they're also anti-foreigner. So although 2/3 of the SNP membership wishes to see Scotland independent within the European Union, a good 1/3 is actually anti-European as well, And that is why I think Nicola Sturgeon refuses to talk about what currency arrangements would be if the case for independence were to be won. She has talked about a Scottish pound. She has drawn attention to the fact that banknotes issued by Scottish banks do not look the same as banknotes issued by the Bank of England for use in England. But the reality is Scotland would have to grasp the nettle. For myself, I would see no problem in joining the euro, but not all of the First Minister's supporters look at it in that way.
Graham, you mentioned Emmanuel Barroso's statement in view of a potential application of Scotland for membership in the European Union. How do you think the current president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, would answer that question?
I would advise her to consult the former First Minister of Lower Saxony, who led a very enlightened administration bringing together the CDU and the FDP, and who now occupies the influential position of chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament. David McAllister has a German mother and a Scottish father, and I think understands perhaps intuitively more than Ursula von der Leyen what the issues at stake are. I think he would be a very good person to consult in this. I think that any president of the European Commission is going to be under pressure to tread with great care when it comes to the recognition of Scotland or any other country seeking independence. Because there are powers within the European Union, like the Kingdom of Spain, even the Kingdom of France, and perhaps others, who fear any similar breakup of their own member states. But I hope that a sense of fairness would prevail if, after a period of due legal process, Scotland were to become independent and were to apply for membership of the European Union.
Some questions left on the F&A page. One of our guests is expressing his vision. Former Great Britain changes into new great regions and then reaches benefits for itself and for the whole of Europe. What would you think about that? I'm not quite sure what he actually means, but
I'm afraid I'm not sure either. I mean,
yeah,
you know,
okay.
the great in Great Britain is rather like the Sir in my name. You know, Great Britain is great because it is Grande Bretagne as opposed to Bretagne in France. The Sir in my name is something that comes with the territory of having led a political party in the European Parliament. It doesn't really have any meaning. The United Kingdom could just as easily be composed of 4 separate nations, the English, the Scots, the Welsh, and the Irish, living their own lives, as it is as a United Kingdom. A democratic debate can be had about that. But I think that the contribution to the politics of Europe would not differ fundamentally if the constitutional arrangements on these islands were to be different.
Yeah. There's one more currency-linked question. Do you know if Scotland would have any chance to join the Eurozone before they join the EU? What are the criteria for doing so? I'm asking because Vatican City and other small states use the euro.
Well, I suppose
that's a good comparison. Scotland and Vatican. Yeah.
I suppose the question posits the assumption that Scotland might develop its own currency, independent of the pound sterling, before joining the European Union and joining the euro. Yes, it's perfectly possible. Scotland has a proud tradition of innovation in banking. I should tell you that the whole idea of having credit with a bank was something that was developed in Scotland as ahead of anywhere else in Europe. I don't say anywhere else in the world, but certainly in Europe. I have no doubt that Scotland could create its own currency and could find a way of doing it. We have enough highly paid, highly intelligent bankers and lawyers in Edinburgh to do that. The question is, what would be the point of it?
Yes, one last question, perhaps, with a view to the watch. It's almost 8:30. In German newspapers, it was often said that the UK voted for leaving the EU because Britons see the EU as an economic and not a political federation. What opinion do the Scotsmen have on the EU? What are the chances that they also leave us one day? Okay.
I think, with respect, the basis of the question is mistaken. I think the problem for many people in the United Kingdom was that the European Union had become too much of a political union, that they had wished to join or been prepared to join an economic union, but had not wanted to be part of political Europe. I think that is a very short-sighted view. I'm not sure, Chairman, whether your audience can see on the wall over my shoulder a portrait of a man called William Ewart Gladstone. Gladstone was a great, I think probably the United Kingdom's greatest prime minister, and a great liberal at that, who represented the constituency of North East Fife for many years. Gladstone was an internationalist, but he never believed in an unstructured international approach. He always believed that if you want, through free trade, to encourage peace and global understanding and spread knowledge, then you need to do so within institutional frameworks. And it strikes me that that logic applies to everything we are doing in the European Union as well. It would be very hard to me to imagine an economic Europe without a political Europe. But what I could imagine, although I would not welcome it, is the United Kingdom ending up like Norway as part of Europe's economic zone, but having no say in its political development. I think that would be a terrible humiliation, even for a nation, for any of the four nations on these islands. I think it would be a great humiliation for a state which has contributed so much to world development over the last 150 years.
May I ask a last question, Graham? You mentioned, and I found that very, very much intriguing, that if the United Kingdom had joined the European Union in the early 60s, there would have been much less doubt about the membership within the European Union than with the application in 73. I mean, that's a really interesting political thesis, and I would like you to add something, because that's, from a historical point of view, very much interesting for future applications for membership. Why would you say that?
It's something that I have thought about. I can't say that I have studied it in great detail, but I do think that the situation in which we find ourselves as a result of the Brexit referendum and all of the political pressures which built up to that is a situation which has come about as a result of competing nationalisms on these islands. Those nationalisms did not exist to anything like the same extent in the 1960s. Indeed, they only started to emerge in the 1970s. And I think that had we joined as Great Britain, had we been part of the great axis of European advance, which started with the Treaty of Messina in 1957, had we done that, had we been there at the signing of the Treaty of Rome, then these questions might not have arisen. If I look across the continent, other countries which are themselves really coalitions of different peoples, these tensions have not arisen everywhere, when perhaps they could have done. And it may be that the United Kingdom would have escaped them. But that is for some thesis by a budding political scientist at some stage in the future.
Yes. Graham, thank you very much for this very, very smart and clever judgment on the case of Scottish independence. I must admit, I learned a lot tonight. Many of the arguments you mentioned are really fascinating, and I think I will have to reflect on that in the next days. I hope that our guests benefited from your speech as well. Thank you for the many questions you asked to Graham, and that was really interesting to see your views on the issue of Scottish independence. And I think that Graham offered us a lot of very convincing questions. I must say I really enjoyed the conference because of your very smart judgment, Graham. Very outbalanced judgment. That was really interesting. Thank you to my co-host, particularly the Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung, represented by Thomas Ilka tonight. And there he is again. Thomas, thank you for co-hosting tonight's conference. Same applies for the Europe Direct Information Center of the city of Düsseldorf, Evgenia Strauss. Thank you very much. That was a great pleasure to have you all on the screen tonight. Well, we'll see what happens in Edinburgh. Graham, you mentioned the current scandal that is filling the newspapers in these days. Let's hope that we don't face a big scandal, because that would only divert from the very basic questions in the background. Thank you very much to everybody, and have a very nice evening. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you.
Good evening.